Behavioural insights, what's it all about? You mentioned there, it's about this thing about making us more behaviourally intelligent, more behaviourally aware. And the reason that that's important is that as a business, and I think this is a kind of cultural thing, this is a worldwide thing, it's not just a Sellafield thing. But if you think about us, we're a very scientific, engineering, technical type organisation. And when we make our decisions, we tend to make them on the basis of what is the right technical solution, what's the right technical approach that we're going to use. And we don't often think about the human element. But I mean, thankfully, that is starting to change. And even the fact that we've got our team established now is a huge, big change. But I think as well, I've definitely seen a noticeable change since COVID. Actually, I think COVID made people realise how much mental health and things like that impact on our work, and we can't really separate the people element from the work. So there's some nice stuff that we're really talking about now. So culture. So thanks very much for your introduction to the kind of subject there, Howard. And I think what you're talking about is really relevant in this kind of presentation that I'm going to give you now, because when we think of culture, most people will kind of accept and agree that it is a thing and it kind of exists, but we don't really know what it is, and we don't really understand it, and we don't really understand how it can have an impact on us, and also how we potentially help shape it as well. So you might see through some of these presentations of today, I don't know what everyone else has got in there, but you might see or hear some talk of this iceberg model. And this is quite a common way in which we describe culture. So with the iceberg, we've got the piece above the surface, so the bit that's visible to us. So the bit that's visible to us are things like the vision, the strategy of the organisation, the structure, the processes, the procedures, the policies, those kind of things, our shared values. So these are who, this is what an organisation typically thinks of as culture. And this is definitely part of it, because those things that we outwardly state who we are as a business definitely impact on how we act. But that's not really what culture is as such. Those are just, it sounds awful to say because they're good, really good things, but to a certain extent they are just statements. They're not actually what's going on. What's going on is the real culture is the piece beneath the surface. So the real culture is how we behave day to day. What are those unwritten rules, the stories we tell ourselves and we share amongst our colleagues? What are our beliefs and our behaviours? What are the norms that we've established? And that's really what we try to think. That's what we kind of think about with regards to culture. I did some work earlier with Sellafield's quality team a few months ago now, when they were thinking about quality conscience. And I think that comes into all of this as well when we talk about our conscience, because we start to sort of say, well, why does that piece beneath the water matter? Why does culture matter? If we've all got this inner conscience, this piece within us that tells us what is right and what is wrong and how we're going to proceed. So how does this kind of this culture piece influence us? And there's quite a famous phrase that somebody called Peter Drucker used, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. So yeah, you can have a great strategy, but actually if beneath the surface people don't believe and are not bought into the strategy, then it's never going to work, because the strategy itself are just written words, and what we're interested in is what we do day to day. So I'm going to take you through a few of the things that might influence what we do day to day. So I wouldn't say lose the stuff that Howard's talked about, because absolutely, definitely, those are things that you need to be establishing, and there's some great practices out there that you can use for learning. But this is almost like, but beware of the pitfalls type thing. So beware of the little things that can trip us up when I talk about this. So the first thing to understand is what kind of influences our behaviours. We've got this little onion diagram here, and at the centre of that we can see that we've got ourselves, so our kind of physical, mental abilities, our core beliefs, our values. Then we've got the environment that we're working in, so what are the kind of physical constraints we may have as around us, what's our physical ability within that environment. And then we've got the social factors, so that kind of conformity, we're within a group, well, how do we behave within a group? And then we've got the organisational, so within that we've got definitely the culture, but we've also got the piece around the leadership, the work environment, the processes, the structure. So all of this stuff is kind of influencing us. And then on top of all of that, we've then got the external factors. So if you think about how you may have behaved before COVID, during COVID and after COVID, probably potentially three different things. I know certainly my own behaviours would have been influenced by the things that were going in externally to us. And it's just the reason I'm showing you this diagram is just to kind of show you that we can't view work in isolation. We can't view the task that we're involved with in isolation as the written word. And in fact, there's a lot of studies that tell us that 80% of the things that influence our behaviour are not coming from knowledge or awareness. So in other words, they're not things that we can train out of us. So 80% of what we do and the way that we behave are not influenced by knowledge and training. So that's quite a huge kind of stat, really, which is interesting because you think when we, again, not just a Sellafield thing, I think this is just businesses generally, when we deal with the soft, fluffy stuff of behaviours, we don't tend to know what to do. So we tend to say, well, we'll do some training, we'll do some rebriefing, things like that. And it's quite interesting to note that. So really quick whistle stop tour, because there's actually loads in this space. The first thing to think about is how the brains work. So up until around about 2011, we used to think that we were always fully rational. So we used to think that we always had this mind that was constantly engaged, and we could process lots and lots of data, lots of information, and we could reflect on it, and we could make really considered decisions. And actually, in about 2011, there was a guy called Daniel Kahneman who produced did some research, and then later came out with a book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And he came up with this model, and he talks about system 1 and system 2 thinking. So system 1, sorry if I just go back there, system 1 thinking is basically saying that that's the kind of unconscious stuff. So we can't turn that part of our brain off, and it deals with all those automatic things. So things like there's a loud bang behind you, you immediately turn to see what's going on. Is it a car backfiring or something like that? It's really fast, it's intuitive, we don't have any kind of control over it. And it's probably quite likely based on our emotions as well, that I'll come on to in a second. System 2 is the piece that's more considered. So system 2 thinking is the part that's able to deal with the more complex decisions. It's more logical, it's more conscious and thoughtful about what we're doing. Now, the reason that I mention this is, if historically we've thought of us as constantly being this system 2, then historically a lot of our processes and our procedures and those things that may influence us around culture are typically built around that system 2 thinking. So they may be bureaucratic, they may be quite lengthy, they may be quite detailed. This is not saying they are, by the way, they may be. I think we've done a lot of changes over the years. But they've been established with that kind of principle in mind. And in reality, we're not in that mindset a lot of the time. A lot of the time we can't, if you think about when you're working on a task and it's really heavy and it's really intense, it's really exhausting and you need a timeout afterwards. So we just cannot, our brains cannot cope with constantly being in that system 2. So we need to create system 1 thinking, which is a bit more intuitive and a bit quicker and easier to deal with. We need to program the brain to deal with those things. And this is maybe why we start to develop workarounds and create our own local norms around procedures and things. So yes, we may have a procedure, it may be incredibly robust, it may be fantastic, but if it isn't working for the individual day to day and taking into account where their brain might be at, then that may influence whether or not we stick to the process. So that's something to kind of really acknowledge there. A great example that we often give with people is the one around driving. So system 2 thinking, if you were a new driver, you're really thinking about the road, you're really aware of your environment, you're very consciously aware, you're thinking about the road signs, you're kind of noticing everything. You're kind of, in a way, it's probably quite draining because you're really kind of nervously holding the wheel and observing the environment around you. When you come out from your driving lessons, you're probably quite tired. As you become more experienced in driving, half the time you don't think about it. You don't actually sit and think, like, which foot am I using now because it clutches at brake? You just kind of do it. You just do it instinctively. So that's what we mean by system 1 thinking. So these are the things that we'd start to see in there. But it's definitely important to recognise that when we talk about procedures and processes. And then the other bit, I don't know if anybody here has ever heard of something called the chimp paradox. This is an older theory now, developed by a guy called Dr. Steve Peters, world-renowned psychiatrist that does a lot of work with sports in particular, done a lot of work with British Olympic teams and things. And he just basically took the brain and he took it away from the neuroscience terminology and he started to explain it in terminology that we could all understand. And he says that within the brain we have a stone of life, and that is our core values and our beliefs. It's our truths, it's the things that make up our world and the perspectives that ground us. And that's quite unique and personal to us. It's shaped by our backgrounds and our experiences. So if you think about culture now, then these are the stories that we share. So when we're talking to our colleagues and we're talking about whether or not we may raise a challenge or something, whether or not we follow a procedure, we don't follow a procedure, whether or not we come up with a new idea, that is going to be based on our history, on our reality. So right back in that culture diagram, when we talked about the piece beneath the surface, there was a piece in there about the stories that we share and the norms and the values that we have. And this is partly formed by this. Outside of that, then, we've then also got, and this is again still part of Steve Peters' theories here, we've got these kind of curveballs, if you like, these gremlins and goblins, and there are biases. So those are our preformed belief around others and the world. So I'm going to give you a really simplistic example here. I'm currently doing an MSc in Organisational Psychology. I did not have a good experience with maths at secondary school. And I'm currently studying research methods, which is all about quantitative and qualitative data, which I struggle to even pronounce sometimes. So I've walked into that classroom, that environment, and I am immediately reeling backwards. I don't want to study this. I can't do this. And I will immediately be saying things like that. And that's based on those core beliefs that I learn from school. Now, the reason I mention these kind of things is if you go back to that System 1 and System 2 model, in System 1, when you're making those quick decisions, if you're if you're under pressure and you're stressed, what do you fall back to? You fall back to what your values and your beliefs are, and that will be dictated by what those stories are that you've told yourself from years and years ago, or from new experiences you've had in the workplace. So that's why these kind of things are important. Then we bring in the social factor. So we're social people. We really care about how other people see us, and we're really influenced by how they behave. So we tend to pay attention to what others are doing, and then we conform. So if you think about, you might be in one team environment and you feel really confident and you speak up and you challenge and you have lots of good discussions. But then all of a sudden, we've now switched you and you've now changed teams, you've changed jobs, we've put you into a different environment. Although you as an individual haven't changed, the environment's changed. So what you're probably going to do is hold back a little bit and wait to see how other people act, wait to see what other people say in meetings before you start to speak up. Again, this is very broad brush. This is not everybody. Some people will still speak up, but they may, even though they speak up, they may still feel uncomfortable in doing so. But we're very aware constantly of what other people are doing, and we try to conform towards that. Similarly, if we perceive someone being an authority, we've got a tendency to follow what they're saying. So even if we think it's wrong, we've got that social bias towards obedience. That's possibly over generations is starting to change, but it still exists. It's still a fact. Even if we might challenge amongst our peers, would we challenge a leader? I don't know that we would in a lot of circumstances. And then when we get with the group think type thing, so a group of people can sometimes come to a poor decision, but that because they've got that human tendency to reach a consensus, we want to conform. So even where you may have one person that doesn't agree, how likely are they to speak up if the rest of the group are all saying very strongly one approach? And then again, we've got that anonymity. So I probably think back to the COVID one as a good example of it. If you're out and about and you're aware and you're conscious that people from work may be seeing you, or people in your family may be seeing you, you may behave one way with regards to masks and all that kind of stuff. But if you're on your own, are you behaving in exactly the same way? Because that anonymity piece has a bit of an impact on how we will behave. And then on top of that, we've then got the organisational piece. So I think this ties us right back to the culture bit. So we've got the structures that the organisation has. So are they very hierarchical? Do you feel that you can approach people at different levels in the organisation? Is there kind of a strict hierarchy? How do teams interact and mix together? The systems and processes, how have those processes and the systems been created? Have they been created in a hierarchical fashion, so they're top-down imposed, or have they been created in some kind of collaborative approach? And similarly, the leadership, and this is a really important one because we're going to come on to something else called psychological safety in a second, and leadership is absolutely key in everything. It all does start from the leadership. So although we all have an impact on culture, the leaders must be the ones that are walking the talk. So they must be clear, they must be consistent, and they must be walking the talk on what they're doing. So there cannot be any kind of distinction between the words they're saying and the actions they're portraying. And in that, though, I would say that leaders are human too. So leaders sometimes will get things wrong, and that's okay. The piece that comes into that is admitting fallibility. We can all tell when someone's genuine if they try to bluff and bravado it through the situation and try to ignore the fact they got something wrong, made the wrong judgment call. We will be able to tell that. So I think we need to be able to kind of have people that say, do you know what, I got it wrong in that situation, and actually I really should have listened to you. And that's good. That doesn't make them any less of a leader. They still are. In fact, I would argue that they're a better leader because they're recognising fallibility. And just that kind of reminding you that the culture is something that we all help create. It's a living, breathing kind of monster that changes through the years and is developed through the years by what we're doing and how we feel. So the bit for me, though, underlying a lot of things is if you think about your own careers and you think about where you're in now, or maybe jobs you've had in the past, how safe did you feel to speak, to challenge, to raise new ideas? Now, for us at Sellafield, we've done a big piece of work around behavioural insight. So we looked back historically to say, what are our trends telling us about the organisation and how we make decisions and how we manage things? And what we uncovered was that a lack of psychological safety was impacting us in a number of ways. And this is not new to Sellafield. It's not a new phenomenon. This concept of psychological safety, it's something that affects everybody and all the different teams that they're in. It's just that we happen to notice that it's a particular thing at Sellafield. So we're doing a lot of work in this space at the moment. And the reason I recognise that is because one way to tell if you've got a really positive culture is, do people feel safe to speak? Are they coming out with new ideas? Are they challenging processes where they don't agree with them? Are they challenging the way that things are done here? I'm conscious of time because psychological safety is a whole other concept in itself, and we could do another whole presentation on that. And I'm very up for doing that if anyone ever wants to talk about it. The thing that I would just say to you is we use this model, the 4-stage model of psychological safety, and it talks in there about the different parts that make it up. So we've got to feel valued and respected. We've got to feel part of the team, part of the gang. We've got to feel that we're being listened to, but we've also got to feel that we can use our talents and abilities to make a difference. And we've got to feel that we're able to challenge. So if we don't have all of that, then we aren't going to have psychological safety. And that when you've not got that, that's an indication that there's something wrong with the culture that we need to look at. So last slide here, I promise, Victoria. So we talk a lot in our space about how do we change a culture. And I think this is something that's really relevant when you think about the quality one. And it's around having the right environment. And in the environment, I'm going to put leadership, processes, procedures, the physical environment, the psychological safety, all of that. So you've got to have the right environment for it. But what you've also got to have is the right behaviours. And by the right behaviours, these aren't things that can be imposed upon you. We can't say you must do this. We need people to buy into it. So it needs to be clear behaviours that are understood by everybody, agreed by everybody. And they're all, I guess it comes into the motivation piece. They're motivated, they understand why those behaviours are important and why they must act in that way. and then they feel either a motivation to sustain the culture that they have, or if it needs to be changed, they feel the motivation to change the behaviours, change the environments to help change the culture. So it's really it's everything kind of interlinks together. And I'm really conscious that was loads of me talking, but I'm more than up for any questions. It was a very whistle-stop tour.
I think you're actually off the hook as well.
Oh, even better.
I think I think you and Howard have dodged it.
So this is clearly from Champion Owen. I was trying to raise my hand to ask a question of Claire.
Go for it.
Hi Claire, Claire Champion Owen now. Really interesting presentation, and thank you so much for that. I hope the slides are made available as well.
Yeah.
My question to you is this: where have you seen organizational change in a culture being implemented and being effective? Because as far as I can tell so far, there are variations of this being implemented, but not necessarily receiving the outcome you're looking for. Where have you seen, and why was it positive?
So I think the problem is it changes along the way, doesn't it? So often we'll start to implement something and we might start to see some positive changes, but then something else in the environment changes. So we might change a leader at the top who decides actually we don't want to go down that road. So we then reshape things again. Off the top of my head, I'll be honest, I can't think immediately of any, but what I would say is that doesn't mean there aren't some good examples. I think there are little pockets of good examples, and the reason that the good examples is, and I took a model out of, I was going to share a different model with the screen with you guys today, and I took it out, and I wish I kept it in now. It's the model of behavioural change. So when we introduce change, I'm going to say in the nuclear industry, not just the Sellafield thing, but when we introduce change, we tend to think about the hard business measures, the things that are tangible, the real outcomes that we can see. And actually what ends up happening is we do loads of stuff in the beginning of a change programme, and then maybe 6 months, 9 months, a year down the line, we start to think, well, why am I not seeing any business outcomes? I've done all this training, I've put all these posters up, I've told everybody, I've rebriefed them, I'm reinforcing. We might even have the leaders modelling the behaviour. So why has nothing changed? But actually it's because, and this is the bit where I start doing my heads, shoulders, knees and toes piece, it starts out from the mindsets, it starts out from the cognitive piece. People have to really understand and be clear on that there's a change required and what good looks like. So when you comment that behavioural piece, they need to know what those behaviours are that they've got to be displaying, and they've got to be bought into. That's meaning that we need to change and what that looks like for them. And then we go through into the emotional piece. They've got to kind of connect with that journey. They've got to really feel that it's important. And the example I usually give people there is, we all know that we should go to the gym. We all know we should do more exercise and eat well. How many of us actually do it? I know for myself, I used to hate running. I only got into running when I was then doing it for a charity that meant something to me. So I'd made that kind of connection. And now I've not done that anymore. I've given up the running at the moment. So, but once we've got that, we've bought into it, we've then connected with it, that's when we'll start to see the changing behaviours. And then ultimately that's what will drive the business outcome. So in our space, what we're more looking at now is developing behavioural indicators. Okay. So I'm working with different areas of the business, and I won't kind of name any areas, but in every single area that I go into to look at this kind of stuff, we start out by seek to understand. So we start to get in there and understand, what does it look like currently? What does it feel like? What are people talking about? What's happening in the physical environment? And then once we've done that, we then start to think about, what does good look like? So we talk about naming the behaviours and then making sense of the behaviours. What are the behaviours we want to see? And then from that, we develop behavioural indicators. Now, if we had that in place in every kind of change that we implemented, I think that would really help, because what ends up happening is about a year kind of mark, we change everything again. We're actually, because we're not seeing the business outcome, but actually if we had indicators that said to us, okay, you're not seeing the business outcome yet, but look at all these little things, these positive steps in the dance along the way, then that will lead to the big change. I think what we do is we cut it short too soon. I don't know if that's a really long-winded answer, but
no, I think that was That was a very, very helpful answer for myself, because I am looking at organizational culture, safety culture, quality culture across certain licensees, and you want to help influence positive change. And that's a very good sense of direction I wish to go to. And I don't know if I'm taking up enough time. Last question to yourself again, Claire. You mentioned how culture is affected by policies and procedures. And because we all have a quality background, we all into process orientation. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more, please?
So it can kind of go both ways. It can be influenced positively or negatively, I guess. If we come back to that Daniel Kahneman thing, that a lot of times, historically, when we introduce procedure, or when we have done things in the past, let's go with in the past, we've believed that people need these really detailed procedures. Now, to a certain extent, that might have come out of safety issues as well. So that we often tend to have procedures that might start quite short, and then we build them on the way. So we kind of keep adding to them as different events happen. And we think, well, we better put that in there, we better put that in there. And then what we can end up with is these quite unwieldy documents that are quite, they're not really user-friendly to the person at the sharp end, if you like. And actually that then leads to potentially those individuals taking shortcuts and say, well, you don't need to bother about that bit, that's not that important, you do this bit instead. Somebody told me a good example once, and I don't know how true it is, but I've heard it several times actually, so I'm going to go with it's true. I'm just going to tell you it's true, you can believe me. A trustworthy face. Somebody told me that sorry, my dog's interrupting now. Somebody told me that one of the difference between the British Army and the American Army, when the British Army go and they set up camp in, I don't know, say Iraq or something like that, they set it up and they put the tents up and then they build the walkways. But the American Army put the tents up and then they watch where people walk, and then they put the walkways down. So I guess, to be honest, it works as an analogy. Whether or not it's true, I don't know, but I quite like the analogy that we maybe wait to see what are people doing and how are they working. And I think for me, that's the big argument about getting the end user involved and getting them really understanding how they would use that day to day.
Thank you so much for that. That's really helpful. Thank you.
No worries at all.